Continuing with our reaction to the NPA's decision to prosecute former President Jacob Zuma, Corruption Watch's David Lewis and Nicole Fritz from Freedom Under Law join us in studio now. Thank you so much to the both of you for coming in. Nicole, let me start with you. I mean, we spoke a moment ago looking at the visuals of Musi Maimane popping open a bottle of champagne, whether you were just as excited about the idea of Jacob Zuma having his day in court, but I mean, the feedback seems to be that it was fairly predictable.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think anyone could have thought that Advocate Abrahams was going to be announcing any other decision today.
And yet, we had Mokotedi Mshe come out a few minutes ago, David Lewis, and say he stands by his decision. He doesn't think he was mistaken in 2009.
Yeah, I listened to that interview with Mshe, and I noticed that he said that circumstances change, and I wonder what those circumstances are, because the only ones that I can think of is when he took his decision, Zuma was going up, and when Abrams has taken his decision, Zuma is well and truly down. So I think he made a politically expedient decision at the time. And I have to say, I think that Abrams is probably doing the same thing. I mean, that he happens to be also right in law is nice to know, but I think it doesn't show either in a positive light, actually.
You know, that leads me to a discussion we had earlier with our analysts about whether government institutions are returning to a space of integrity, and there was some discussion about that. I mean, some people felt, yes, there is some measure of that. Others felt Sean Abrams was simply trying to save his skin. How do you feel about that?
I think that that's right, and I think one has to recall that obviously the president in his recent Sono address spoke about the importance of bringing leadership and stability to the National Prosecuting Authority, and that it has been riven by instability, and we've got many court judgments to that effect, and that instability has largely been caused by the response to the charges against former President Zuma. I think this decision holds out the prospect of some stability. I don't think, though, that stability can be assured by having Advocate Abrahams at the helm of the National Prosecuting Authority. I don't think that this decision in any way makes it more likely that he will offer the type of leadership and the integrity that this institution is required to have in order to serve the people of South Africa.
David, when you look at institutions like the NPA and the Hawks, for example, that have seemingly become inured to corruption over the years, how do you go about rebuilding those institutions in a new political era?
Well, it's a tall order. I mean, you certainly start with changing the leadership. It's often said about Burning Ntlemeza's regime at the Hawks, that one of the only things that he achieved was putting in place the next 30 members of the leadership layer. So the problem goes quite deep, which is not to say that everybody in those institutions is compromised. I mean, I think what's going on now is partly a consequence of the change in leadership, but I like to think it's also that some people now are able to do what it is that they always wanted to do and thought right to do. But changing those institutions, transforming those institutions, reforming those institutions is going to be a big task. But the first, in the NPA, certainly, get rid of Abrams. I'm afraid the person who is so far been the lead prosecutor, or the leader of the prosecutorial team in this case, Advocate Nicole from KZN, is also actually a compromised person. I noticed Pierre de Vos said, depends what sort of prosecutorial team that they have, and I wonder if he didn't have her in mind. So, I think the rot spreads wide, but it doesn't necessarily spread deep, and it has to start with the leadership.
Are you worried about the leadership of the prosecutorial team in this case, Nicole?
I can't speak to the specific individuals concerned. I mean, we haven't come up against them, but yes, certainly there are other members within the National Prosecuting Authority that I think have been compromised. Freedom Under Law at present is seeking the institution of a commission of inquiry and the suspension of 3 prosecutors from the National Prosecuting Authority, Advocate Abrahams, Advocate Pretorius and Advocate Zinyati, and this relates to their conduct in respect to the prosecution of Pravin Gordhan and 2 others, Opama Gashula and Ivan Pillay. And there we saw what we thought was reprehensible conduct on the part of prosecutors within the NPA, where evidence, exculpatory evidence that should have been available to them was withheld. When representations were made, they had to review that prosecution, but that evidence should always have been available to them. So we have seen time and time again within the NPA at this present time cases, actions taken that lead us to fear the quality of leadership and some of the staff members in the employ of the National Prosecuting Authority. And I think if it is to serve the government and the people of South Africa with integrity, changes are going to have to be made. We saw, obviously, the courts uphold suspensions of Mkhobo Jiba and Lawrence Mwebi. Again, persons who hadn't conducted themselves with any sense of integrity within the National Prosecuting Authority. So I would only underscore what David says when he says that it goes wide. It's not a single. It's not just the person at the helm, in this case Advocate Abrahams. It goes beyond that, but notwithstanding that, there are persons who we now hope will have the freedom to act as they should, and will feel that their hands are strengthened.
You know, both your organisations have taken several cases to court as civil society. David, talk to me a little bit about how much of a bastion the courts have been in contexts where the executive and Parliament have let the South African public down.
Well, they've been huge. I mean, the courts, the media, and civil society have been responsible for placing us where we are now. You know, they've been extraordinary, and you know, there can be few institutions in the country that give the people of South Africa as much comfort as the courts, and it's an extraordinary story. I mean, I still can't, you know, explain to myself how the courts seem to have escaped the cap, but there are, you know, explanations. There's not a bad system of appointing judges. Nicole may disagree, but it's transparent and it's got to be reasoned in some sense, and publicly reasoned. So I mean, the courts have been a godsend. I mean, there's no other way of putting it. I'm sure the Chief Justice would appreciate knowing that he's been a godsend. But it has been they have been a real godsend, and they remain, you know, at all levels of the judicial system.
You know, the statement you make reminds me of something Musi Mamane said this afternoon with regard to the appointment of officials like this, Nicole. He spoke about the appointment of the National Director of Public Prosecutions and said it was a flawed process. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think if the appointment is properly done, I mean, one has to recognise that one has this 10-year period where one should be insulated from political interference, and I think persons appointed there to the processes in place for their removal are quite stringent. So it's not an easy process. I mean, this was why, in fact, the 2 organisations challenged the settlement that was granted former NDPP Solising Krasana, that was improperly done. It didn't follow the process. That you couldn't simply pay an amount of money to the NDPP and send him on his way. That the processes of removal are pretty stringent. So I think our problem is not so much that we don't have sufficiently stringent laws, it's that they're not being observed in terms of protecting these institutions.
I was just going to ask you, though, about the issue of the president singularly having the power of appointing that person. I mean, some suggestion was made that this person ought to go before perhaps a panel at Parliament. Would that not be more advisable in the case of appointing an NDPP or a public protector?
No, I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, to the extent that a process of appointment entails wider consultation, the opportunity for others to test that person's fitness and propriety is absolutely vital. So it can't just be that the president gets to determine the fitness and propriety of that particular person. And I think that we can only have greater confidence in that person's ability to fill that office if that process does include sort of greater representation, transparency, involvement of other parties. So I would agree with that, yes.
David, in a wider sense, what has our experience with Jacob Zuma taught us about the flaws, the Achilles heels, if you like, in our law?
Well, I think one of them is the appointment process. I mean, he has huge appointment powers. The NPA, not all of the heads of the law enforcement authorities, many of the heads of state-owned enterprises, and that's really got to be reviewed. I mean, it's often said that when at CODESA the parties were arguing about what the best appointment process was and they couldn't agree, they all said, well, give it to Madiba. And I think the lesson is you make laws for the worst possible president, not the best possible president.
That's right.
And I think that's, those aspects of the Constitution need to be revisited, but the appointment powers in the Constitution and in some of the subordinate legislation of the President are far too great. I mean, we've been very involved, as we did in the public protector issue. Next year, I think the Auditor General comes up for reappointment. All of these institutions should be appointed in some sort of transparent process, and arguably that, as I said earlier, is one of the reasons why we have a judiciary of the quality that we do, because there is this searing process of examination. But you occupy positions of that power, then you need to have the confidence of the public, and you need to be subjected to that kind of scrutiny.
Yeah. And I would just follow on. I mean, I think that is borne out by our involvement in the eNCA case, where we have insisted that in fact the relief granted should involve the reinstatement of Advocate Nkosana, that it's not sufficient just to say, well, it's just an equitable for this position to be vacant and the new president gets to appoint a new national director of public prosecutions. We're saying this process of appointment should be observed to the extent that it is found that his settlement is unlawful, that the termination of his employment was unlawful. He should be reinstated in that position.
Thank you so much for your insight. Lovely to have both your perspectives into the civil society talking to us this evening on the news that Jacob Zuma is about to be prosecuted. David Lewis from Corruption Watch, Nicole Fritz from Freedom Under Law joining us in studio.